What is going on, guys? Today we're going to be talking about Goblin Slayer and its philosophy and psychology. Now, if you don't know, Goblin Slayer is an anime set in a fantasy world that has a more grounded realism. Right? It still is Tolkien-esque where it has, monsters and magic, but there's some realistic groundings too. So there's some sort of elements of anime, like and manga, like Berserk, and like George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones type deal. So with that out the way, let's get started talking about the anime. Now, Goblin Slayer starts off with Priestess. Priestess is a sort of cleric, right? She can, in a video game or RPG, she would be the kind of person that casts healing spells and or protection barriers from any kind of oncoming projectiles for your party. She finishes her formal training in the priestess role, probably going to a seminary school of some type. And she goes to this guild hall in this undisclosed town to take on a quest, an adventure, become an adventurer. To this end, she meets a party of three other like-minded individuals who had just probably finished their formal training and are ready to go out in the world and make something of themselves. She meets a young swordsman who probably had been proficiently trained decently in, sword fighting. She meets a young wizard who has elemental magic, who can use explosive fire bolts and stuff like that for, long ranged attacks. And she meets a sort of monk who is adept in hand-to-hand combat. The wizard is female, the monk is female, and the swordsman is male, and priestess is also female. They go up to the adventurer's desk and request from the guild lady a goblin killing quest, because goblins are easy, right? So with a sort of sour look on her face, we'll later find out why. The guild lady gives them the goblin kill quest, and they set out to go fulfill their adventure. Now they arrive at a cave. This party has been hastily put together, and likely these individuals are poorly funded, right? We know that the swordsman comes from a very rural area, so likely he is also poor, and he, basically has put everything he had into equipping himself with a nice, good sword, which he is very proud of. But the party lacks anything like potions and any kind of health. This is why they mainly recruited priestess in case of any kind of healing that the party needs. She could cast healing, which, by the way, she can only cast up to 3 spells a day. So there is a limiter to how useful she can actually be to a party. So they go into this cave to kill this supposedly easy to kill enemy. And right off the bat, we notice that the sword from the swordsman who is swinging it is too long for the cave. Now, any person that has been trained in any kind of sword capabilities or tactics Topics, the great YouTuber Shadowversity pointed this out, would immediately realize that while a swinging motion may not necessarily yield the best results in a confined space, the longness of the sword would best be used in a thrusting motion like a spear. But we can assume, since this person comes from a poor village, that he's probably not had the best, if all, training. It's quite possible that he's had no formal training. He has just put himself out in the world to go forth and kill goblins. The Archmage is, probably a prodigy, right? She's probably someone who will, stereotypical mage, adept in her field. The monk fighter presumably comes from a long line of monk fighters who are good at their craft and are legendary in their martial arts. They enter their cave, and the hastily formed party proceed to make their first mistake. Now, anyone who's played an RPG or MMO will tell you the one thing you never do is abandon your healer or leave your long range offensive character build, i.e. your mage, your attack mage, unguarded, because while the attack mage is very good at long range spell casting, when it comes to being overwhelmed up close, your mage will most certainly die. So the goblins are smart, right? They adapt to their current situation if you let them live long enough, i.e. like humans. If you let a human evolve or develop over time, they will get smarter and wiser. So the goblins have seen that their cave, the particular cave that they live in, is very, very dark. So there's another passage that's cut into this cave, right? But before you get there, there's a statuette, a doll that's placed on a stick, which is meant to distract newbie players so that they don't see the cave that's adjacent to the wall. And what happens is, while these other characters are distracted, this party's distracted, the goblins proceed to come up from behind and envelop the mage and the priestess, and they want to take them out because they're easy targets. The mage gets overwhelmed, even though she had killed one of the goblins. She gets cocky and she ends up getting stabbed right in the gut by a knife. Has her staff broken. She can, I guess, presumably no longer use magic. The other party members proceed to come back to rescue their party members. And the swordsman gets all cocky. He's right, I'm going to save the day. I'm going to come here and kill all these goblins. And he does kill some goblins. He starts swinging. And then all of a sudden he swings and his sword goes flying. Now, when his sword goes flying, he's immediately pounced on by a horde of goblins. They proceed to rip him limb from limb and feast upon his flesh while the man is still living. We know this because you hear his screams. Seeing presumably, I'm guessing, her best friend, maybe they were in love. You don't know because you don't get any character development. And some people have criticized this, but I think it's important that, that they not necessarily have any character development, because these things, these hard topics happen every day, these harsh realities to people we don't know. So this is sort of a window into the realities of these people who we don't know. So the monk goes in to save her friend. She is fighting off the goblins with her kung fu, which she has presumably learned from her ancestors and, her forefathers. And she is set upon by a huge hobgoblin, a great big goblin who grabs her and slings her like a rag doll. She hits the wall, and then Priestess watches as these goblins set upon her and tear her clothes off in all demonstrably, manner, and proceed to horribly rape this young woman. You see, this whole type ordeal with the monk rushing in was to give time for Priestess to escape. With the wizard, the monk almost certainly thought she was going to die, but she thought she could at least allow part of her party to escape by sacrificing her own body. So Priestess escapes with said wizard, and they go further onto the cave, where they are yet again set upon by goblins. The goblins proceed to rip the wizard's clothes, much to the dismay of Priestess, as she can really do nothing for her, and she is herself injured when she is shot by an arrow. And here comes forth in this dark, dismal time. When I see this scene, I think of Bonnie Tyler's In Search of a Hero. Right, Priestess is Bonnie Tyler, and Goblin Slayer is the White Knight who rides up. Goblin Slayer, in all his Doom Slayer might and glory, proceeds to lay the smacking down on some goblins. But while rescuing Priestess, he comes to the realization that this young wizard is not going to survive. You see, Priestess previously had cast Heal on the wounds of this wizard, but she wasn't getting any better. And then we learned that the reason why she doesn't get better is because the goblins have put poison on their bladed weapons, and if you are stabbed and you don't have the right antidote, you will most certainly die. This comes back to the party not being properly prepared or having the knowledge to take on this goblin quest. Now, Goblin Slayer has the antidote, because we see him use the antidote to heal himself because he's stabbed, and I don't remember, because it's been a couple weeks since the first episode. I don't know if he gave it one to Priestess. I don't remember quite. But we know he had the antidote. And he doesn't give the antidote to the wizard because she's already too far gone. The antidote simply, after a certain period of the person being, poisoned, will not work. So Goblin Slayer does the next best thing. Rather than have this person suffer a grueling, agonizing demise, presumably while at the same time being horrifically raped, he is going to give her mercy. He proceeds to stab her in the throat, and she basically dies instantly. The Priestess, again, has to watch all this happening. This is all being ingrained in her psyche. Goblin Slayer then begins to use Priestess in an offensive manner, and he manages to get the drop on a bunch of goblins and kills them, kills the goblin leader, the pre-goblin priest, and then he discovers a nest of young goblin younglings, goblin babies, in a scene that's reminiscent of Return of the Jedi, when Darth Vader sets upon the Jedi temple, and then proceeds to slaughter all the younglings. So too does Goblin Slayer and all his badassery proceed to murder goblin children. And you are greeted with the terrific screams of goblin children as they are being slaughtered. One could only listen in sometimes joy as these goblins are being slaughtered because of how demonstrably horrible we know them to be. But also, it is a horrible scene because if you basically look at it, the metaphor for goblins is humans. You can't have, you can't have a series where you murder humans, but it's not looked upon too kindly unless it's done in a certain manner, where you just have a character going in mass shooting or mass stabbing humans, regardless of how bad said humans are. I'm pretty sure if you just had a scene where, like in Goblin Slayer, where all this manner of setting people ablaze and stabbing people Mad Max style, people would almost certainly be more abhorrent with the show than what they were when they showed rape. But these goblins are a metaphor for the worst possible aspects of humanity, people who give in to their evolutionary impulses without using reasonable thought, people who would rather take what they want. These goblins are the worst of humanity. And rape is a situation of power. People want to project power over their victim. These goblins almost certainly represent that sort of power dynamic. Whereas Goblin Slayer is the person who is tasked with dealing with this monster while himself having to deal with the demons that said monster has placed upon him. Because there's an important part to Goblin Slayer's backstory. Goblin Slayer himself was a victim of goblin attack. He himself was not raped, but a horde of goblins set upon his village and raped and presumably murdered his sister being the person who took care of him because presumably his parents were dead, which was all too common occurrence in the Middle Ages, right? Older siblings raising younger siblings because the parents somehow died. So this person who is his mother figure, he has to watch underneath the floorboards as she is demonstrably raped. So there's a psychological aspect to Goblin Slayer, is that he sees the threat goblins pose. And he goes out to ensure that what happens to his sister, his family, doesn't happen to anyone else's family. That's why his only goal in the show is to eradicate the goblin scum. Of course, we know that he will never accomplish his goal because goblins are seemingly endless. We never get a number to actual realization of how many goblins multiply, except for a comment Goblin Slayer makes in the first episode that they could, in presumably an hour, have 50 other goblins, which is crazy considering how these goblins reproduce. Is they rape human women and impregnate them with the baby goblins. We can then surmise that if the goblins sort of age rate, right, the age to which they reach maturity is fast, so these goblins are being born almost like flies, that the goblin children that Goblin Slayer murdered very well might have been I almost don't want to say offspring, but I have to, offspring of the monk who was raped, as the wizard was incapable of getting Earth since she was killed by the Goblin Slayer. And the monk does survive. She is rescued by Goblin Slayer, and she, through some exposition, we learned that presumably she goes off to join the priesthood as some kind of nun, right? So, in Goblin Slayer, there's this dynamic with Priestess, right? Priestess is very close to Goblin Slayer. It's almost like a reverse Stockholm Syndrome situation. Whereas, like, in Stockholm Syndrome, the person who's being kidnapped will feel a close attachment to the individual. We have sort of like a survival syndrome. I don't know what the exact psychological term for it, if there is one, where the individual will feel more love and respect for, or admiration for, the individual that saved them. I mean, you can kind of see this phenomenon when you have situations where hostages are taken and they, get affectionate towards the police who go in and save them. It's sort of that deal, except, on I guess, a bigger scale, because Priestess ends up joining this party with Goblin Slayer. And, you can see that she feels an affection towards Goblin Slayer. She's starting to develop feelings for Goblin Slayer. Now, one has to ask the question, is Priestess feeling these feelings for Goblin Slayer because she legitimately loves Goblin Slayer? Or is she feeling these feelings for Goblin Slayer because there's some kind of psychological attachment because of the trauma she experienced and Goblin Slayer rescuing her? And Goblin Slayer ends up joining a party with some more individuals, some kind of lizard man who can control bone magic or whatever, that creates a bone creature that can fight with him, and he also is skilled in one-handed, two-handed dagger combat. A elf who is a stereotypical elf, as she is a green-haired, long-eared elf who is good at archery. So thank you, Lord of the Rings. And a dwarf who is a stereotypical dwarf who loves to drink, and he can perform earth magic. And to an extent, this earth magic, he can not only manipulate the earth, but also use dust to put his enemies asleep. So this party ends up going out to kill goblins. Now, they are given this quest by this archpriestess, right? This archpriestess in a past was a hero. So she, I guess, defeated a demon lord, and she, is a well-respected member of society. But she ends up getting raped by goblins, and this has an immense psychological effect on this individual. So she sends for, because she's heard songs about Goblin Slayer, right? Because in this world, it's not normal for a person to want to go out and hunt goblins because they are seen as a lesser enemy. It's not becoming of goblin slayers' skills to go out and kill goblins. Because if you look at Goblin Slayer's character, right, he's not a physically built character. He's not your tank. But what Goblin Slayer is, and you see that throughout the series through his use of different tactics and weapons, is he's an extremely smart individual. He can adapt to a situation very easily and devise certain tactics to win the day. I would put him on par with Shiro from Long Horizon when it comes to, sort of that, mind of tactics and battle. Or, Lelouch from Code Geass. So, Goblin Slayer, he's not very physically fit. So they go into this cave underneath the city where the archpriestess has given him this mission to slay goblins. And they figure out that the goblins are using some kind of mirror transport to transport themselves across their vast areas, and they are using boats. Again, this is showing how dangerous these goblins are. Not only are these goblins using technology, but they also can reproduce at a rate that they could very easily outnumber every human on Earth 200 times over. Again, this is showing how dangerous these creatures are. So they go forth and they kill these goblins. And then in the next episode, they are holed up in what I'm guessing used to be a church or whatever, because this is like a city that was built on top of the ruins of a former older city. So they go into this church and they are set upon by a goblin champion, which is a super-sized goblin that's bigger than the hobgoblin that smashed up the martial artist and who Goblin Slayer dispatched with ease. Giant behemoth of a goblin. And Goblin Slayer proceeds to get demolished, right? And there's a scene that's engraved in my mind where Priestess freezes, right? And you can tell this is like almost a PTSD type situation. Priestess is getting flashbacks of when she was set upon by the goblins in the cave when she formed her first party. And she's watching her savior, Goblin Slayer, just get the shit kicked out of him. And she hesitates and she gets injured. But Goblin Slayer, being the total badass and genius he is, uses a teleportation scroll to use water pressure from the bottom of the ocean to slice apart the Goblin champion in half and quickly dispatches him before passing out from his injuries. He is then healed by a priestess, and there is some sexual things that goes on with that. But yeah, that's that. Goblin Slayer ends up after this situation developing a friendship, a bond with his party mates, because he realizes that he can't do everything by himself. This leads to the finale of the show, where Goblin Slayer realizes that the house where he lives, because he lives with a childhood friend and her uncle on a farm that produces dairy products, that the farm is the village is getting ready to get attacked by a horde of hundreds and hundreds of goblins. And he goes to the guild to seek help because he realizes that he cannot handle this on his own. And then he proceeds to basically beg the guild mates for help, right? Now, we know from his own dialogue at the end of the episode that the same thing happened to his village. His village was attacked and set upon by a horde of goblins. But when people in the village went to the guild hall and posted a quest for the goblins to be slayed, nothing happened because no one regarded goblins as a threat. But you see, Goblin Slayer has been building up goodwill in his community. We learn from one of the side characters, it's not really shown very often, that the reason why he took on the quest to help Goblin Slayer kill these goblins is that Goblin Slayer saved his village, right? That by going in and killing the goblins that were routinely setting upon his village, that he probably saved this man's family. So there's an immense respect, even though people in the community ridicule Goblin Slayer. Within a few people, influential people, there's an immense respect for Goblin Slayer. So when Goblin Slayer basically begs the guild to help slay these goblins, the people who are influential saying, yes, we will aid you, all we want in return is a drink, they proceed, to go help him recruit other people in the guild because they see that, these influential individuals are going to help kill goblins, then the threat must be real because these individuals see a threat. And the owner of the guild, the first time we ever see him is in the scene where he offers up 1 gold piece, which is probably a lot of money, for every goblin head that is taken. And again, this is a lot of money, so it's going to entice others into killing these goblins. So the reason why I could think that this wealthy capitalistic individual would pay this much money for a goblin kill quest is probably twofold. Probably he sees the danger of goblins, right? He sees that, Goblin Slayer is worried that they will use the village, his farm, as a staging area to mount a larger invasion force of the village and potentially kill all the men and take the women as sexual slaves. So Goblin Slayer sees the threat. This capitalistic individual probably sees the threat. He also probably wants to thank Goblin Slayer because Goblin Slayer has probably saved a lot of young lives by taking these goblin kill quests. And so, long story short, they end up killing all the goblins, and the day is saved, and we are getting a season 2. Hurrah! But yeah, this has been sort of my thoughts on the subject